told you that Shanks lost his arm on purpose. Now, while some of you would probably say, oh, well, that doesn't sound super unrealistic. I mean, Shanks is ridiculously powerful. How did he lose his left arm to an East Blue Sea King? Others amongst you might go for a more rational route and say that Shanks only lost his arm to a Sea King because at that current moment in time, Oda didn't plan on making Shanks as powerful as he currently is. And that really does tend to be the two camps that people fall into when talking about the event of the first chapter of One Piece that happened over 20 years ago, with people being split between giving an in-universe and outside-of-universe explanation as to how Shanks lost his arm. However, what's cool about writing a manga for over 20 years whose ending you absolutely were not planning when you were penning the first chapter in the 1900s is the fact that you can make events from the past relevant in your current day manga because you're the one in charge. And I believe that is exactly what Oda is doing right now in Elbath. See, over the course of the last two arcs, those being Elbath and Egghead Island, characters like the Holy Knights and the Five Elders have become incredibly prominent and very dangerous foes. But what makes the Holy Knights and the Five Elders so ridiculously powerful, so ridiculously dangerous? Well, while we don't have a concrete answer, the answer that most people would give you would be the Mark of the Abyss, a pentagram that appears on the back of the hands of the Holy Knights and the Five Elders that not only gives them the apparent ability to teleport really wherever they want to, but also gives them access to demonic, monstrous transformations and makes them effectively immortal. However, in the most recent chapter of One Piece, that being chapter 1148, a weakness to the power of the Mark of the Abyss may have been revealed, as Scopper, yes, Scopper, not Scooper, Gabon revealed to us that by slicing off Sommer's left arm, the arm that had his Mark of Abyss, he may have been able to inflict what could be a deadly wound to his foe. And while we're not entirely sure as to whether or not it is the fact that Scopper did cut off the arm that bore the Mark of the Abyss on Sommers, that stripped Sommers of his immortality, if cutting off Sommers' arm that bore the mark did strip him of his Mark of the Abyss powers, and therefore stripped him of his connection to the world's government, we could be seeing, almost 25 years later, the real reason that Shanks lost his arm to a Sea King. Yes, I'm saying that Shanks' left arm had a Mark of the Abyss, and he used the Sea King to get it off. And I'm gonna be honest, guys, after hearing this theory, it's really the only way I can rationalize that moment displayed in chapter 1. And now I want you to hear all about it. So no further ado, let's get directly into Shanks lost his arm on purpose. And if you guys are loving the new One Piece content, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Or if you're just looking for one additional Nick video a week, you can find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. We're on to the tuning exams. So, let's be real with ourselves. The longer One Piece goes on, the weirder it is that Shanks lost his arm to a sea beast, right? Like, regardless of how powerful the sea beast or Sea King was, even chapter 1 Shanks was way too strong to be injured by anything that came out of the ocean. In fact, after everything that we've seen Shanks do now, with one arm, mind you, really the idea of him being injured at all seems patently ridiculous. Now, some of you might say that we've really only seen Shanks post this moment, and there's no way for us to speculate how powerful Shanks was before he got his arm bitten off, but that's not necessarily true. We know a fair amount of things that Shanks did pre this moment. I mean, Shanks, before he saved Luffy, was already sparring with Dracul Mihawk in battles that were so incredibly even that they would go on for days, and that was with the world's greatest swordsman. And while we've never really seen Mihawk be like 100% serious in battle, we know at the very least he is regarded as the world's greatest swordsman. He can easily cut Navy battleships in half, and if he is still feasibly the world's greatest swordsman, that means that he is stronger than the current iteration of Zoro, who, mind you, has kept up with and blocked attacks from Kizaru, the Five Elders, Scopper Gabon. He's beaten a Lunarian in a fight, King, and went toe-to-toe in combat with not only the greatest Cypher Pole agent currently in existence, but also an awakened Zoan type user in Lucci, and like really not struggled all that much in that fight. It's really not crazy for us to assume that Zoro was probably somewhere right now in the region of a Katakuri level of strength. In fact, he's probably well beyond a Katakuri level of strength. He's probably somewhere in the region of a King level of strength, especially when you consider the fact that he was able to beat King in a fight. Now, as to whether or not Mihawk Katakuri could beat King in a fight, I'll leave that up to you to debate. Regardless, if Mihawk is still stronger than Zoro, and we have no real reason to believe that Mihawk has gotten stronger since Shanks lost his arm, this means that there's really no reason for us to believe that the Shanks that lost his arm to a Sea King wasn't somewhere in the region of at least as powerful as Zoro currently is in the story. And this is corroborated by basically everything we know about Shanks prior to him losing his arm. Like in the fact in the immediate lead up to Shanks returning to the East Blue, he was battling it out with CP0 and CP's strongest agent at that moment in time, Who's Who are all guarding the Gomu Gomu no Mi that Shanks wanted to get his grimy little mitts on. And Shanks was able to not only get his grimy little mitts on the Gomu Gomu no Mi, but he was also able to defeat Who's Who so convincingly that he literally had to quit working for the government and become a pirate. Now, mind you, this was before Who's Who had consumed his beast devil fruit and started working for Kaido, and thus he didn't have his Neko Neko no Mi model saber-toothed tiger, but after being expelled from the CPs, he was powerful enough to start his own pirate crew that eventually got absorbed into Kaido's pirate crew, becoming pretty immediately one of the strongest of the beast pirates. And considering the fact that the beast pirates were probably the strongest pirate crew in existence before Luffy wandered into Wano, being in the upper echelon of that pirate crew means you're one of the most powerful people in the universe. And Shanks beat him so convincingly the government went, no, never mind, we don't want you anymore. Not to mention Shanks was literally raised on Goldie Roger's pirate ship and is the child of Figure Garland, a literal Holy Knight, the head of the Holy Knights actually, and current 5 Elder member. All that is to say, whether strength comes from nature or nurture, Shanks kind of had it pretty good in both regards. Being born to one of the most powerful families in existence and then being raised by one of the most powerful men in existence. And then when you consider the fact that one of the men that raised Shanks, Silvers Rayleigh, swam through the Calm Belt all the way to Amazon Lily to go see Luffy, mind you, without a log post, and then when you realize that there's really no reason we should assume that an older, undoubtedly weaker version of Silvers Rayleigh is any stronger than peak power 2-armed Shanks was, and that the Sea Kings that are present in the Calm Belt are notoriously larger, more vicious, and more powerful than Sea Kings from any other part of the world, and yet Rayleigh was able to swim through the Calm Belt with next to no issues, undoubtedly using a combination of Conqueror's Haki to knock out Sea Kings and Armament Haki to stop any and all incoming damage from other Sea Kings. It kind of makes the idea that anybody, Shanks very much included, from the Goldie Roger pirate crew would be able to be hurt by a Sea King seem kind of asinine. So why and how did Shanks lose his arm to an East Blue Sea King, a level of Sea King that non-Gear 2 having Luffy was able to knock out? First gear, Gear 1. Well, the actual and kind of boring reason as to why Shanks lost his arm to the Sea King is because technically he had already done it. See, while this has been a heated and contentious topic in the One Piece fandom for 20 or so years now, there's technically always been an answer as to why Shanks lost his arm in the moment that he saved Luffy. And that answer was because he already did lose his arm. But that's confusing, so allow me to elaborate. See, One Piece, like tons of other popular manga, wasn't actually Oda's first attempt at breaking into the manga space. In fact, One Piece, very befitting of being one of the most successful manga of all time, got its start in the same way that a lot of the other greatest manga of all time, like Naruto, Dragon Ball, and Chainsaw Man did, as it technically started with a one-shot. See, a thing that a lot of manga reader fans don't know is that a lot of the most popular manga on Earth all started with a one-shot. A short 30 to 50 page one-chapter piece of manga that tells a short, concise story as a kind of tester idea to see if these characters could be popular in a longer, more fleshed out story. And this is how a lot of the most popular manga of all time got their start. Whether it was Kishimoto with Naruto releasing a story originally about a young nine-tailed fox bore from a incredibly non-popular and villainous nine-tailed fox, and therefore that boy has to be raised by strangers in a community that hates him because his father is a villainous deity. Or Tatsuki Fujimoto releasing a one-shot about two characters named Kenji and Naota, as Kenji, the main character of the one-shot that later became Chainsaw Man, whose main character is Denji, has to work odd jobs to try and keep his devil little sister Naota fed, happy, and outside of the purview of the general public. And many One Piece fans don't know that One Piece started in a very similar way, with a one-shot released in 1996, the year I was born, called Romance Dawn. And Romance Dawn is almost one-to-one retold in One Piece, at least as it pertains to the beginning of Luffy and Shanks' relationship and how Luffy got the Gomu Gomu no Mi. The only difference between the one-shot and the One Piece telling of this story, it's that it's a shark that eats Shanks' arm in Romance Dawn and a Sea King that eats his arm in One Piece. And consider the fact that Romance Dawn kind of just ends with Luffy becoming a pirate and never turns Shanks into some kind of ridiculous Haki Susanoo using Hockey Man, but rather just ends his story by saying that he's one of the most 3 famous pirates in all of history. The idea that Shanks could lose his arm to a shark wasn't all that ridiculous. But when you import that story into One Piece and then write 1,100 more chapters, all of which makes Shanks more powerful than the last, the importing of that story doesn't make all that much sense because you're importing a story that ended after 50 pages into a story with 500,000 pages. It's like closer to 25,000. That was a hyperbole. So like the real actual reason that Shanks loses his arm saving Luffy is because he loses his arm in the one shot that One Piece is based off. But that doesn't mean that that moment can't get an in-universe explanation 24 or so thousand pages later. If we assume that the medium length of every One Piece chapter is 17 pages and we times that by 1,148, that's 19,516 pages. Anyways, so if an in-universe explanation can present itself to explain what otherwise is explained through an outside of universe explanation, what would it be and how would it come along? Well, that's possibly what recent chapters of One Piece have began to give us. See, if we assume that Shanks, like all of the other Holy Knights, had a Mark of the Abyss on his left arm, and that by losing his left arm, he would be unmarked, the idea that he would want to get rid of that left arm actually makes a fair amount of sense. See, while I will admit that the idea that the Holy Knights and maybe the 5 Elders' biggest weakness is that if you cut off the Mark of the Abyss from them, they lose all of their Mark of the Abyss powers is not my favorite explanation to explain what's going on with Scopper right now. It is a pretty straightforward weakness and explanation. And consider the fact that relatively broken immortality-based powers like the Lunarian's fire have had pretty straightforward explanations and weaknesses, like the fact that you can't injure a Lunarian while their flame is burning, and that you can't injure a Logia type unless you use Haki. The idea that cutting off the Mark of the Abyss from a Mark of the Abyss user cuts them off from the powers of the Mark of the Abyss is a pretty One Piecean way to get around that immortality. And there's actually a pretty good basis for the idea that Shanks did have a Mark of the Abyss. See, because while we do know that Shanks was found in a chest on God Valley by the Goldie Roger pirates, and therefore raised by Goldie Roger and the rest of the crew, we learned in chapter 1138 from Shamrock, Shanks' older twin brother, that Shanks has actually returned to Marijois at some point in time. Now that's kind of all we heard from Shamrock, but the direct quote from Shamrock is, "That pirate is my estranged younger twin brother. He returned to the Holy Land once, but he seemed to prefer the filth of the lower world." Now this is interesting because we don't really know the context of when or why Shanks went to Marijois. However, the fact that he was there at all kind of lends to the idea that his family probably would have wanted him to be a Holy Knight. In fact, I can really envision this family reunion going down in one of 2 ways. See, as to why Shanks returned to Marijois, I can't really say. The best possible explanation I can really think of is the fact that he maybe wanted to uncover where he came from, and that journey brought him back to Marijois, where he met his twin brother and his father. But as to how that meaning ends up with Shanks acquiring a Mark of the Abyss, well, like I said, there's really 2 possible explanations. The first explanation, and probably the more likely explanation, is that upon realizing that his son had been raised by pirates and was the head of his own pirate crew currently, Figurlin Garling realized that his son, who was massively powerful, needed to be reined in, controlled, kept an eye on. And thus Figurlin Garland, Shanks' father, in an attempt to at least corral but maybe control Shanks, placed a Mark of the Abyss on him, with the hope that eventually the temptations of this massive power would bring Shanks back to the world government. And we've heard this kind of story before. In fact, if we assume that when Shanks returned to Marijois, he got a Mark of the Abyss, his story is actually eerily similar to that of Sanji and the Vinsmoke family, where Sanji is an estranged son of the Vinsmoke family, a group of emotionless mercenaries who cast out Sanji because his one default was the fact that he had emotions, and thus it was Sanji's empathy that eventually led to him being cast out of his own family. And because of Sanji's disconnection from the beliefs of his own family, he not only keeps them at an arm's length, but also doesn't rely on their technology, like their raid suits. And in fact, Sanji getting rid of his raid suit is a very symbolic moment to separate himself from the Vinsmoke and fully fully dive into the person that Sanji wants to be as a member of the Straw Hat Pirates, and thus Shanks allowing for a Sea King to eat his left arm and therefore disconnect him not only from the world government, but also from his family and the power of the Mark of the Abyss could be Shanks' version of destroying the raid suit. However, that's not the only possible way Shanks could have acquired a Mark of the Abyss. See, while yes, I do believe there's probably a better chance that his father placed it on him against Shanks' will, there's also the possibility that Shanks just elected to get a Mark of the Abyss. That Shanks decided that if he wanted to be one of the greatest pirates of all time, having as many powers as possible would come in handy. And thus he returned to Marie Joie to tap into the power of his bloodline and the Holy Knights and the Five Elders. But after getting the Mark of the Abyss and understanding the sinister nature of that power and its possible connection to Emu, Shanks realized that if he wanted to become the world's greatest pirate, using a power derived from the corrupt world government wouldn't be the way that anybody in Shanks' life would want him to go about accomplishing that feat. And thus, as recompense for the idea of giving into the temptation of acquiring the Mark of the Abyss, Shanks in a somewhat ceremonial way gives up his arm, not only as a way to forgive himself, but also in a very fitting moment considering the fact that he gave up his arm to save Luffy, a boy who would later become Nika, the freer of slaves, but also a boy who represented all of the good of the pirate world and how much it meant to be a pirate in opposition of the government. And thus, if in this moment Shanks losing his left arm is actually him casting away the world government and his connection to being a celestial dragon, and he's using that moment to try and project Luffy in the right direction, it not only makes that moment much more important, but it also kind of in a way puts Luffy and Shanks on the same journey, starting at the same pivotal moment. And it would make Shanks kind of the first person to ever be broken out of the icy grip of the world government by Luffy. And considering the fact that the Celestial Dragons have a long, storied history of branding people, especially the people they view as slaves, the idea that Shanks is branded with a Mark of the Abyss that he actually sheds while saving Luffy, who Shanks at this moment may or may not know is going to become the reincarnation of Nika, the god of the sun and the freer of the slaves, and thus in a very historic and very important moment, Shanks literally casts off his own cuffs in the form of losing his arm, not only launching Luffy on a career becoming the world's greatest pirate, but also making Shanks the first technical person that Luffy ever broke out of captivity. And all he had to do was lose his left arm. And I don't know about you, but I massively prefer an in-universe explanation for the events of things happening in-universe than an outside-of-universe explanation. So while yes, Shanks did lose his arm because he loses his arm in Romance Dawn, Oda spinning the block 25 years later to explain why Shanks lost his left arm, saving Luffy with in-universe evidence makes me much happier. But what about you guys? Why do you think Shanks lost his left arm to a Sea King in the East Blue? Do you believe it had something to do with the Mark of the Abyss? Or do you believe Shanks just genuinely got jumped? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, it's Magic Monday. I gotta go prep some decks. We're playing the new Final Fantasy set.